first step for us at the HSRC to start thinking about what is the research agenda that a science council such as the HSRC needs to be adopting going forward. And so we thought we would make this opening dialogue fairly broad. We've got some really interesting guest speakers for our panel today, but we also want to invite you to ask your questions. Now, if you are like me, I discovered AI properly on about the 7th of December, just before I went on holiday. And well, that put paid to my annual holiday because I was so intrigued by what I discovered on ChatGPT, on listening and talking about AI through all the video pieces of information that were coming out on all of the newspaper articles, etc. So today, what we want to do is we want to explore the ethical implications for research. We want to look at these issues related to employment and equality and concerns arising from this very quick adoption of AI through ChatGPT predominantly, but also there've been sorry, please would you mute yourself, Siegfried? Would you please mute yourself? So there's been a lot of concerns arising from the adoption of AI. Quite recently, there's been a call for a moratorium for the next 6 months on the development and rollout of further AI engines. And some of that is perhaps because of commercial competition. Some of it is because of a real concern about the future of our human race. And so there's been a lot going on in the media, a lot going on behind the scenes, a lot going on in the universities and the think tanks and the tech institutions of our world. We want to think about the potential for AI in promoting socioeconomic development and exacerbating inequality. And we want to think about some of the really deep issues around where we go to from here. I want to say at the beginning of this dialogue is that no question is too small or too kind of non-technical. I think that in the people who are in the room, we've had about 100 responses, and I can see people are joining slowly, but we've got people in the room who are academics. We've got people in the room who are from government. We have people from NGOs and NPOs, and we have people who are training and studying. And so we welcome all of your questions. No, there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you don't understand some of the technical terminology, please feel free to put it in the chat. When it comes to the discussion time, we'll take your question and we'll try and answer them. And some of the things that we're going to speak about today are a little bit conjectural and speculative. We are not presenting research today. We are presenting a dialogue, and we've got an incredible number of well-qualified panelists who I'd like to introduce to us going forward. So the first panelist is a person who is on the HSRC staff, and that is Krish Chetty. Krish is doing a PhD at the moment at Nelson Mandela University, and he's looking at knowledge management incubators. For me, the really important piece that Krish will bring to the discussion today is that Krish has got a background in technology, in computer science, and in banking before he became a researcher. He's currently a research manager at the HSRC in the Equitable Education and Economies Division. And so what Krish... David, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. And so what Krish does is he brings this kind of convergence of the fields of research and technology and will offer us an overview of some of the issues that are in the current domain. But also he will present at the very beginning some ideas for research that the HSRC is currently thinking about. And then he's going to ask you for some input. Colleagues, please can I ask you to mute if you, as you enter the room. Thank you very much. Then the other three panels are distinguished panelists. Professor Stephen Sidley is a professor of practice at the Johannesburg Business School in Artificial Intelligence and Crypto Technologies and Economies. He's an award-winning and shortlisted author of 7 books, 5 of which are fiction. So that's really exciting, Stephen. It's good to have you with us. Stephen has also been writing for the Daily Maverick, and I've certainly spent the last few months learning from Stephen's work through the Daily Maverick. He was educated at the University of the Witwatersrand and the University of California, Los Angeles, as a computer science MSc, and was also amongst the first wave of video game developers. So I think that's an exciting array of backgrounds, but has now also co-founded multiple technology companies. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Stephen. And I'll tell you when I ask him to speak, the kind of direction that he'll be taking. Our next panelist is Dr. Hang-Yi Chen, who is sitting at the moment in Taiwan. He is the managing director of Meta Intelligence, a think tank and consulting firm that conducts research and provides solutions on the metaverse, on financial technologies and cutting-edge innovations. He is also the founding director of the Metaverse campus at Zhejiang University International Business School. And he was the academic director of the Master of Finance MBA and the Global Executive Education Program at Zhejiang International Business School. So we're really excited to have you with us, Hang-Yi, and thank you for combating the time difference and all of that in order to be with us. We really look forward to hearing from you. Our third panelist, Dr. Rachel Adams, is unfortunately called in sick. She is down with some flu, and so she won't be joining us, but both Krish and I will cover some of her input because she was going to be speaking about some of the issues of justice as it relates to AI and technology on the African continent, but also some of the issues around ethics that has come to light and that has been published and spoken about in Time magazine and in the newspapers, the New York Times around the world. So Rachel won't be with us, but we'll cover some of her input. And then Advaitha Naidu is the managing director of Jackhammer Global for Africa. And she says she's had a brief career at the HSRC, and I remember her briefly from way back. But she was really important to see desk work translated into commercial outcomes. And so she packed away her journals and threw herself into the world of executive search, where finding a great leader can impact the corporate and NPO landscapes in unexpected ways. So Advaitha will be speaking to us from the point of view of HR and human resources and what it means for the workplace, what AI means for the workplace. So Advaitha, we're really pleased to have you with us, and thank you so much. Advaitha is sitting in Cape Town, and so we're very pleased to have you with us. I'm going to hand over to Krish immediately, and Krish is going to provoke us with a few clips and pieces from the media that we've been collecting for the past few weeks, and then he's going to describe something of the research agenda that we're thinking of and ask for your input. So Krish, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlene, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're off in the East. Thanks for joining. We've got quite a few slides that we want to go through just to give you some background in where this discussion is going. So I'm just going to put on my screen here so you get a sense of what these issues are. Yeah, so what we want to do today is just share with you a few provocations just to get the brain juices flowing, as it were. So I've collected a few videos from YouTube where people are talking about where AI is going, what the big issues are. And so I'd like to just share these ideas so we can really stimulate the discussion and help us put on our thinking caps. To kick things off, Bill Gates recently wrote a blog post, and he spoke about how blown away he was with all this new technology that we're seeing. And so what I'm going to play here is an excerpt from his blog. We've used an AI program to read out the blog post for us. So we could have used some sort of deep fake where we would have mimicked his voice, but I was too cheap, I guess, to spend the money on the tool. So I'm just going to play you this artificial voice reading Bill Gates' blog.
The development of AI is as fundamental as the creation of the microprocessor, the personal computer, the internet, and the mobile phone. It will change how people work, learn, travel, get healthcare, and communicate. Entire industries will reorient around it. Businesses will distinguish themselves by how well they use it.
So thank you. Yeah, so that was Bill Gates. So as you know, this webinar is focusing on three broad dimensions. We're looking at issues of employment, equality, and ethics. So I'm going to begin now just with how AI might impact employment. So there's these big questions: are our jobs at stake? What are the big trends on the horizon? So let's get into it. The first trend that we're seeing in the world of work is something new that's quickly emerged, and it's something called prompt engineering. And so here's a taste of what some of the tech leaders are saying on this topic.
People are developing some skills around knowing how to ask GPT questions in the right way. Exact prompt engineering. Why? Because GPT is a command line interface. So if you ask GPT a simple question about what's the best restaurant in Napa, it knows how to answer that. But there are much more complicated questions that you kind of need to know how to prompt it in the right way.
A great prompt engineer is going to become a title and an actual skill, the ability to interface with these
Here you go.
AIs.
Coding
and that
School
prompt
2.0.
engineer, well, no, a prompt engineer, somebody who's very good at talking to these instances and maximizing the result for them and refining the results for them, just like a detective who asks great questions. That person is going to be 10 or 20 times more valuable. There's going to be somebody who's sitting there like, remember Tom Cruise in Minority Report as a detective was moving stuff around with the interface, with the gloves and everything. This is kind of that manifested.
Yeah. The next big issue that comes up is the issue of economic growth. And what I want to do is share with you an excerpt from a recent Goldman Sachs report. And it recently tried to predict how AI might impact global productivity. So here's a snippet from that report, again, with that artificial voice talking about economic growth in the United States.
A Goldman Sachs study posits that global productivity could see an impressive uptick, ultimately boosting global GDP by 7%. In the US, economic growth could leap from the anemic range of 1% to 1.5% to a more robust 2.5% to 3%, reminiscent of the booming 1950s and 60s.
The report also highlights which jobs they think would be affected. So in this graph that I've got here, which is extracted from their report, the dark blue here indicates where tasks are most unlikely to change. So here where they've estimated there'd be less than a 10% range of changes to the work that you do. The light blue that you're seeing in this graph is where AI might complement between 10 and 49% of your tasks. And where you see the gray blocks, that's where AI is likely to replace more than 50% of your work. And so what Goldman Sachs is saying, at least in America, is that the least changes are going to be found among those jobs where you have physical labor, so your building contractors. But the most changes are going to be found actually in white-collar jobs, your admin workers, your legal profession, education, software developers, architects. And this is quite an amazing change that we're starting to see. And it's reversed many of the predictions that were made less than 6 months ago. Nobody really predicted that it's the knowledge workers that would find their jobs under threat. The next issue I want to deal with talks to issues of equality. And so here I'd like to refer you to an exchange that was held earlier this year between Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella and Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, which was held in January this year. And so here, Nadella is actually talking about quite an eye-opening moment that he had, one that has influenced me also quite personally and has inspired some of the ideas that we have for our AI project.
I was in India at the beginning of January. And I saw this demo, Klaus. In India, one of the things that's very exceptional that's happening is digital public goods that are getting built for identity, payment, many systems. And one of the digital public goods that's getting built is for language translation, right? So basically they have an open source project so that anybody building any application in India can translate between any language in any Indian language. So a demo I saw was a rural Indian farmer trying to access some government program, right? So he just expressed a complex thought in speech in one of the local languages that got translated and interpreted by a bot, and a response came back saying, go to a portal and here is how you'll access the program. He said, look, I'm not going to go to the portal. I want you to do this for me. And it completed it. And the reason why it was able to complete it was because a developer building it had taken GPT and trained it over all of the Government of India documents and then scaffolded it with this speech recognition software. So think about what that meant, right? That basically meant that a large model, a foundational model that was developed in the West Coast of the United States a few months before, had made its way to a developer in India who then sort of added value to it to make a difference in a remote villager's life. And I've never seen that type of diffusion.
Yeah, so what he's saying here is that we can start to see these new systems as knowledge diffusion tools. So there's great opportunities there for an organization like the HSRC that is actually in the business of knowledge, and we need to be able to share our knowledge. So great opportunities here to learn from this example. The other big issue that we need to deal with, particularly here on the African continent, is that of the digital divide. And I think this video here nicely summarizes the challenges that we face. And so it's not just about getting on the internet, it's about what you're missing out on if you're not actually connected to these tools. So here's another short video just summarizing those issues.
We're living in an age where technology is becoming so incredibly powerful that it's not just like having a slightly better car or a slightly nicer house. These days, the divide is between people who are using technology to become almost superhuman. Think about someone who has mastered how to use a computer, who can connect to anyone in the world, can access any piece of knowledge they want, has taken dozens of online courses on any topic you can imagine, and the divide between that group and everyone else who doesn't have those advantages just gets wider and wider. The average person with a personal computer connected to the internet has resources, informational resources, that the President of the United States did not have even just 20 or 30 years ago. And they're using those resources. They're using them to become even better, even faster, even richer. I think that's the main reason the divide is getting worse, is simply the compounding advantages on this side of the divide that aren't available to everyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
We're living in an age.
So yeah, the next issue I'd like to touch on relates to ethics. And so I just want to touch on three big points here, which have come up in this space. The first deals with the topic of intellectual property, specifically related to the text-to-image space. I don't know if you've been following the new tools that have been coming up, where we've got some amazing new pieces of software, web services that have been trained on the works of other artists. And so the question is, who owns this art? So there's a group of artists that are now suing the AI systems. But then there's questions, is this an issue of just inspiration? Is the AI software becoming inspired by their art? Or are there real questions here that relate to intellectual property theft? And I think that gets to the heart of where this lawsuit actually is. And so here's a vlogger, which is actually talking about these issues, summarizing these points.
Sarah Anderson and a handful of other artists have filed a lawsuit against the companies behind the three major AI art generators, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and DeviantArt's new tool, Dreama. They claim that their art was used to train these models without consent or compensation, and now it can create very convincing replicas of these individual creators. As such, they are seeking financial compensation for the lost revenue. It was only a matter of time before someone sued, and I hope that they have the evidence they need to win.
Yeah. While we're on this topic of intellectual property, I also want to raise a few points about data justice. Our colleague Rachel Adams, who sadly couldn't be with us today because she fell ill, she was actually going to speak to a recent project that was produced by Research ICT Africa. And they've looked at just understanding what data justice actually means. And so they've put out a policy brief recently which talks on this question of ownership. And so they've come up with a few recommendations on how we should be revising policy on data so that we can then hand back ownership of the data to those that create it. So I'd recommend, if anybody's interested in this space, to look up the work produced by Research ICT Africa. And if you have questions, please do get in touch, and we can connect you with her.
OpenAI signed 3 contracts worth about
The next issue that I want to speak to is also an issue that Charlene mentioned in her opening remarks, is about a story which has come from Kenya, which was published here by Time magazine. And what happened was that OpenAI had actually subcontracted a company in Kenya, to actually categorize and analyze the most harmful content on the internet. So the worst things you can think of, they had passed it on. And they expected these workers who are getting minimum pay to actually start analyzing this content and start categorizing it. And so the question is, could you really think of this as decent work? I mean, it's the worst of the content. And so they were taking advantage of these workers in Kenya due to their perhaps lax regulations on this sort of subject. So here's a blurb that we've got from this Time magazine report, which shares some of these experiences.
OpenAI signed 3 contracts worth about $200,000 with Sama in late 2021 to label textual descriptions of sexual abuse, hate speech, and violence. 3 employees told Time they were expected to read and label between 150 and 250 passages of text per 9-hour shift. All employees interviewed described being mentally scarred.
And then the last point I want to speak to comes from the education sector, and perhaps they've been rocked the most by ChatGPT. You know, many teachers and lecturers now are a bit unsure about how do you handle the way students are actually engaging with this sort of tool. How do you handle issues of plagiarism? But at the same time, the counter argument that emerges is that the education system also needs to evolve. And many are looking to ChatGPT and this generative AI solutions as the new calculator. And is this something that should actually be banned? And so people are saying that they're asking, is this a tool that perhaps, is it promoting just laziness, or is it a tool that promotes critical thinking? So here's some thoughts from an American tech entrepreneur who's sharing his ideas on where this is headed.
Watching all the schools around the world ban ChatGPT is so devastating to me. They would rather have kids memorize things that they could look up on the internet in 1 second than to teach critical thinking. The reason AI is going to be so profound is it's going to teach critical thinking. You have to put something in the AI for something to come out. We have a chance to teach these young kids around the world right now actual critical thinking. That is actually how life works, and yet we're banning it throughout the world.
Yeah, so that gives you a sense of where people are thinking, and I just want that to really just spur the debate on. Is it a tool for critical thinking? Is it something that we should guard against in the education system? So we're asking the question now. So that gives you a sense of what perhaps the big issues are in this space. While I have the floor, I'd also like to take the opportunity to quickly talk about some of the plans that we have in our division to take advantage of these various AI tools which are coming to the fore. And while OpenAI is still somewhat open and making them accessible, there is an opportunity for us to build something useful for the public, something that policymakers could take advantage of, something that could be useful in the academic sector. So what we're doing is that we're putting together a small team with very basic software development skills. And we plan to use ChatGPT as the senior pair programmer in the team. And so we're going to work with the machine because it's actually quite fantastic at writing excellent computer code. And so we will be the prompt engineers that prompt it to help us build custom tools. And what we want to do is prove through these tools that with minimal expenditure, perhaps we can actually build something that's quite useful, perhaps somewhat groundbreaking, if we use these tools correctly. And so today we're sharing these ideas, but we also want to spur on spur on you. We're looking for ideas on what we could actually do, how we could apply these tools to perhaps solve some of the problems that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Our first idea involves building an HSRC research chatbot. So if you know the HSRC, we have a large team of researchers and many projects. We almost produce too much research outputs. And so we produce these outputs perhaps faster than the ordinary person can consume. And so we have a public engagement problem, perhaps. So the question is the ordinary person in Langa actually have any interest in our work, and how can we target our information so that it does perhaps answer some of their questions? At the moment, we might not be speaking the right language, or perhaps our style of speaking is not aligned to what they expect. At the same time, we also want to make our research more accessible to the policymaker. We don't want you to just read the one-page summary document, but rather give you the tools so that you could drill deeply into our work and engage with the issues that matter to you at a more detailed level. And so OpenAI, the GPT models that they've produced, they have something called application programming interfaces that they've made available. And they allow you to do just this. They allow you to build these custom chatbots that I'm talking about that could be trained on HSRC research. For us, we need to figure out where we start, like which sort of research do we actually feed into this model, considering that our organization has produced research over many decades. But in summary, what we want to do is create these tools that make it easier for you to have that deep conversation with the HSRC's knowledge base. And then that gives policymakers that opportunity to drill into the work and go down the rabbit hole, asking various questions and finding out what it all means for new policy creation. And we also want to give the ordinary person the tools to be able to talk to the chatbot in their local language and learn about what our research is saying. So we want to build that knowledge diffusion tool that Satya Nadella was talking about in the early video I shared. And so yeah, as we make progress in this respect, we also then want to publish our experiences so people get to learn from us as we go along. The second idea that we have will involve using the infrastructure that we've built in the first project, but then feeding it with education policy documents. And so here we'll be able to explore quite deeply the differences in policy created by the multiple spheres of government that we have in different institutions, and perhaps then provide us the means to explore and identify areas of policy misalignment. And so this chatbot will not only be useful to HSRC researchers who grapple with policy analysis on a day-to-day, but also policymakers who need to identify where are the sticky points related to a particular issue. And so we're making this information then more easily accessible to the public. And so we might just begin with education policy. And once we prove that this is useful, it could be over time extended across all the various other sectors. And then perhaps even over time, we could even extend it over the entire continent if we get the model right. So the question is, how would all of this work? And so here's, just to end, here's a short video of how we might engage with a ChatGPT type model that's based on HSRC work. So here I'm talking to ChatGPT, asking it about the HSRC. So you could just imagine that this is the type of conversation that we might be able to have with HSRC's research. So here's the ChatGPT interface. I'm asking it to describe the HSRC in South Africa, and it gives you this whole, it churns out this text and it talks about the HSRC. Then I'd ask it, just give me 5 topics that the HSRC is involved in. So it's talking about poverty, gender, social cohesion. And then it also spoke about the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this, I asked it the question, tell me more about what your research said about the COVID-19 pandemic. And so you can then do this, conduct this deep dive, as it were, into the subject matter and find out more about our research. So the more we feed it, the more it will be able to do. At the moment, ChatGPT is only able to speak to the textual information that was loaded perhaps on our website before 2021. September 2021. But we'd like to feed it all our policy briefs, our research outputs, so that it's more detailed in what it's able to do. But yes, that gives you a sense of where we're going. So before I leave you, just with this presentation, what we're asking is, what else could we do? What could we do that will have the most impact? We're not short on problems in this country, but we've got to try and figure out what are the new ideas, what are the new solutions that we could bring. And so we're asking you today, where do you think AI could be used to fix a problem? And how could we also perhaps build a network where we could continue to share ideas and come up with new plans for the future? We're starting with a small team, but the more success we have, the better it will, the easier it will be for us to perhaps expand in the future. So please do, as you get an idea, please do drop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring this. And in the second session today, I'll be pooling all of the inputs that you've copied, that you've put in the chat. And then together we'll work live with ChatGPT, and we'll try and build a joint research program, building on the two projects that I've shared, but also capturing the new ideas that you provide us today. Thank you, Charlene. That's it from me.
Great. Thank you so much, Krish. And so, colleagues, I hope you're feeling provoked. I hope it's starting some of the questions to emerge in your mind. One of the things about those video clips is that most of them have come from the global north. And so we are going to be looking very carefully and closely to some of the tech centers in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Uganda, in South Africa, because we also want to hear people's comments and raising the issues for our continent, for the global south. But Krish has set us going with some of the thinking. One of the examples that he raised around summer in Kenya, getting young people to actually teach the bots not to use toxic content has an effect, an ethical effect on young people's lives. The one thing that article doesn't say is that Summer Source in Kenya for the last 10 years have been employing tens of thousands of young people who were previously unemployed, in terms of actually getting them to firstly populate kind of self-drive technologies, and now to kind of, filter the toxic content for AI. So you can see that there's ethical dilemmas on both sides. So I want to turn to Professor Stephen Sidley. I've introduced him before, and I'm going to ask Stephen to talk about how AI will affect the future of work. Maybe he wants to pick up on this idea of prompt engineering, knowledge diffusion, but also some of the big debates that have been happening in the recent week about AI as a generative tool for the future of humanity, or potentially the end of humanity. And so, Stephen, what are the ethical issues and how should we deal with them? Over to you. Stephen, you're on mute.
Okay. I want to try and touch on three topics. One is on some of the ethical issues. The second one is some of the labor-related issues. The third one is I want to try and get to some of the issues around the copyright and why I think that copyright lawsuit will fail with the artists. If we don't get to it in the first 15 minutes, perhaps we can pick it up in one of the panel sessions. So let me start with the ethical issues. Charlene, it's 10:40 over here. I'm going to try to be right on time at 5 to 11. Right. So on the ethical issues, first of all, I want the audience to understand that artificial intelligence, artificial life, artificial thinking has been around for a very long time. It has been talked about 8000 BC. We read from Greek mythology. We could go to, we could go to 800 AD when there was a fellow by the name of Jabir ibn Hayyan, and he developed the Arabic alchemical theory of Takwin, which is the artificial creation of life, up to and including humans. We could go to Rabbi Judo Low, who has said to have invented the first clay man brought to life. Obviously, these people didn't really do these things. They are written about in various mythologies, but one would expect that during the writings of the time, there was, let's be polite and call it robust ethical debate. The real first stab at talking about the ethics of AI was, funnily enough, from fiction. There was a science fiction writer by the name of Isaac Asimov. There was a book of short stories that he wrote called I, Robot. There was a particular short story called Roadrunner, in which he wrote down the 3 laws of robotics. And I'll see if I'm going to find them for you. Okay, so he says, this is 1950 something, right? A robot may not injure a human being through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm, or allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first or second law. Now, you can immediately see the problem over there. Any half-decent litigator would rip that apart. And you would rip that apart by saying, what does injure mean? What does harm mean? What about if the robot is presented with the trolley problem? Now, the trolley problem is a very well-known problem in philosophy, where if you are given a switch on a railway line, the train is bearing down and it's going to kill 5 people, but you can throw a switch and turn the railway car onto another line that will only kill 1 person. In other words, you're given 2 morally abhorrent choices. Which one do you choose? By your action, do you kill 1 person, or by your inaction, do you kill 4 people, 5 people? So those sort of ethical problems, how do you build that into artificial intelligence? I'm going to skip right over now, because the field of AI really took root in the mid-50s, and it started getting built. And in the year 2000, it fractured off into 2 directions. And the reason it fractured off into 2 directions is because 3 things happened around 2000. Storage got very cheap. Compute power got very cheap, and speed of telecommunications got very fast, essentially unlimited. And because of that, the field of machine intelligence, which had been stuck because it needed so much compute power and storage, suddenly took off. And you saw tens of billions of dollars going into machine intelligence projects, which has come to this point over here with ChatGPT. Importantly, in that period between 2000 and 2017, lots of things were being done in AI with machine learning, things that we know well, like picking up your cell phone and having it look at your face and it recognizes you. That was done via machine learning. The self-driving cars of Tesla, there's a whole bunch of stuff that was done. But in 2017, the subject of ethics sort of started growing enough gravitas that the first ethics conference was held in Barcelona called the Essalomar Conference, in which there were a whole bunch of big heads. There were sociologists and philosophers and computer scientists and physicists and what. And they came up with a series of proclamations, okay? And I'm going to tell you what some of those proclamations were, because they're very high-minded. I'll give you one example that came out of that. Okay, item number 11 out of this conference says, human values, AI systems should be designed and operated so as to be compatible with the ideals of human dignity, rights, freedoms, and cultural diversity. Well, yes, that's all very easy to say. It's all very high-minded, but how does one do this? Coming out of that conference, you had the policy frameworks put in place in the United Kingdom, which are now underway, policy frameworks put in by the EU Commission, which is now underway, also very high-minded. The problem is, when you try to stick an ethical framework on top of something like artificial intelligence, it will only work if everybody in the world conforms to it. And I can promise you that a fundamentalist terrorist or Putin or other bad people in the world do not have the same ethical viewpoint as we have. And I can see no easy way that you can set up a set of guidelines that everybody adheres to. It was easy with nuclear weapons because people were scared of getting blown up. So we have mutually assured destruction. With ethics, it's a different story. We all don't have the same worldview. So I do not have a good news story about that. How am I doing on time? I've been going for 5 minutes. I'm doing good. Okay. Now, really importantly, and it was mentioned by Charlene, about 3 weeks ago, an institute called the Future of Life Institute puts out a plea. And it is signed by 1,300, again, very big thinkers. Everybody from Yuval Harari to Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, to Elon Musk, to Lawrence Krauss, the physicist. Basically what they said is, we don't know what the hell we're doing here. We don't know what we're doing. This stuff is expanding exponentially and we do not understand its implications. Let's everybody pause for 6 months until we can think this thing through. And a whole bunch of people said, yeah, well, that's a very good idea. I'll tell you who didn't think it was a good idea. And I'll tell you who laughed at this is people like Putin and other bad actors in the world who are not going to pause any of this stuff for anybody. And so all we're doing is letting bad people catch up. It gets worse. There is a researcher, public intellectual, computer scientist by the name of Eliezer Yudkowsky. Now, Eliezer Yudkowsky is one of the fathers of artificial intelligence and one of the most cited machine intelligence researchers in the world. He reads this thing, this plea to stop for 6 months, and he says, no, 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 no. He says, we don't need to stop for 6 months. And I'm going to see if I can find his quote over here. He goes beyond that. He says, I'm going to quote, and I want you all to steel yourself from what he said, because this guy's a very smart guy who is probably deeper in this field than anybody else. He said, this is the beginning of last week, many researchers steeped in these issues, including myself, expect that the most likely result of building a superhumanly smart AI under anything remotely like the current circumstances is that literally everyone on Earth will die. Not as maybe possibly some remote chance, but as in that is the obvious thing that would happen. Of course, such an extreme statement from such an important and well-considered academic and intellectual burst Twitter aflame. And the consequence of that is there's been some pushback. There's been a bunch of people who've said, no, surely not. And others people saying, no, that can't be. And other people saying, you're an idiot. And as a result of that, there's been this ethical cage fight, is what I called it in the Daily Maverick article I wrote just yesterday, if you want to go look it up. There is an ethical cage fight. Nobody understands the stuff. And the reason nobody understands the stuff is twofold. The first reason is that in previous technologies, the internet, the cell phone, you name it, TV, radio, those are technologies that improve in very small increments over time. And even those that improve in small increments over time, we were terribly bad at predicting what the consequences would be. 2003 article from Forbes magazine said, it was 2003, right? At the current rate of energy usage, the internet will gobble up all the world's energy by 2050. We're terrible at predicting this stuff. We predicted that social media would be a boon to democracy, boon to truth, and we know what's happened over there. Now you move to the world of AI, in which you have an exponentially improving technology that improves by itself. It is autonomous. It learns by itself. It learns outside of human control. There is no way we can understand or predict what's going to happen in that regard. That gets me to 10 minutes. I'm going to move off the ethical debate. It is fraught. The solutions to it are opaque. The approaches to it are Pollyanna-ish, and I am not sure how we control this thing in the future or whether it is in any way controllable. Let's move on to the future of work. One of the charts that Chris put up was from a Goldman Sachs report that came out recently, which was really badly reported by the press. One of the problems with all this stuff is you go to the popular press where there are journalists who are not steeped in this stuff, and you just get like spectacular alarmism. 300 million jobs are going to disappear. That is not what the report said. I want to read you a rebuttal to this Goldman Sachs report. The Goldman Sachs report did not talk about jobs disappearing. It talked about jobs being affected. They are two totally different things. And one of them has a utopian consequence, and one of them has a dystopian consequence. Let me give you the two statements. This is not in the report. This is what I saw on Twitter. The dystopian statement is AI will take half of your jobs. The utopian statement is AI will take half of your job. In other words, AI will replace some of the tasks that people do, but will not automate away 100% of their job, which simply makes them more productive. So what does it mean, this AI will take away your jobs? Does it mean that a human is replaced by a machine? Does it mean that a human is replaced by a machine and gets a similar job from a different employer? Does it mean that a human is replaced by a machine and goes and moves to a different kind of job with the same employer? Does it mean that a human is replaced by a machine and goes and gets a different kind of job? Does it mean that a human uses a machine to do some of her job tasks and does less work overall while retaining the same job title and the same employer, et cetera, et cetera? Unless you can define what it means for the AI to take over some human tasks, you cannot say that it's a bad thing, because they're not going to take over 100% of the tasks. If you read that report carefully, only 7% of jobs was going to go away, not the 32 or 45% or all the other numbers that were thrown around in Fortune magazine. Move on to the prompt engineer. So that's just the Goldman Sachs report and the alarmist talking about jobs. I wanted to make one other point there. In the last 10 years, from about 2010 to 2017, there have been multiple reports, Citigroup and various others, that there are going to be a large amount of jobs lost because of automation, because of computation. This was before AI. You know what? In the United States today, everybody who wants a job can have a job. They've got 4.1% unemployment, and the 4.1% who are unemployed don't want a job. So you have extremely high employment in the face of these enormous studies that saying everybody's going to be unemployed. In the global South, clearly we have different problems. In South Africa, our problems with unemployment are largely structural and political, and not because of technology. And that's a different debate that perhaps we can get into. The prompt engineer, that's just one new job amongst many that will be created by this technology. I will also say that, by the way, 80% of the jobs in the world today did not exist 60 years ago. They were all created by technology. Every time a new technology came around, people said everybody's going to lose their jobs. And what happened is a whole new classes of employment arose, which will happen with AI. The prompt engineer is, I want to read you if I can find it. No, I don't think I can find it. Yeah, there it is. It's an ad for a prompt engineer, which is really funny. There it is. Okay. The ad is from Anthropic, which is one of the most heavily funded AI companies in the world. They're worth $1 billion without having done much yet. Their ad for a prompt engineer, and I barely paraphrase here, says, please send us some prompts that you have come up with that gets an AI to exhibit complex behavior. That is in the entire job description. One sentence. It pays 5 million Rand a year. There is no precedent for a prompt engineer, but I will tell you that GPT-4, when you ask it a question, you can ask it a question up to 60 pages long, and it can spit out an answer up to 25,000 words. That's a novella. That's a research thesis. 25,000 words is a lot. So the skill that is required to ask it a question in the correctly shaped form is going to be somewhere between art and science. It's not like asking, as the guy in the video said, give me the best restaurants in Napa. You can write 50 pages of question and it will give you a well-structured response up to 25,000 words. Okay, how am I doing on time here? Charlene, talk to me. I've got 1 minute. Will you give me 1 minute to wrap?
Sure.
I just want to get to the issue of copyright. Here's the problem with the lawsuit that the artists are suing those 3 image companies because they use the images in training. Here's the problem with the lawsuit. Any smart lawyer is going to say the following thing. A student goes to university, art student. What does he do at university or she do at university? She gets lectures, she sees art on the walls, she goes and gets art books, she sees art in the book, she goes to museums, she sees art in museums. And that combination of art swirling around in this young aspirant artist's head eventually catalyzes her to make novel art. That is exactly what these image programs do. They go to publicly available sources, which is online textbooks and gallery brochures, and sucks in all those images and mixes them up and produces something novel. And it's going to be very difficult for anybody to argue that what an art student does is any different than what one of these AI image systems does. And I think I have got to my exactly 10:55. Bam!
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was phenomenal. And colleagues, I can see that the questions and the comments are appearing in the chat. Please, won't you go ahead and add some more? I know that the burning question is, How is the world going to end because of AI? But Stephen, I'll leave you to answer that in a minute, according to Eliezer Yudovsky. But also bigger questions. And so I'm going to actually just hang straight over to Hang Yi, who I have introduced already. Dr. Hang Yi Chen is the founder of Meta Intelligence, a think tank, but also has been involved with the Zheng Yi International Business School, and will talk to us a little bit about this potential between decentralization, so that AI can be used for small businesses and for changing people's lives, versus corporate monopolization. And also, what are some of what is the role of Chinese AI regulation, and how is that affecting our world, and how is it going to be affecting our world? And of course, then the ethical issues, right? So included in that is some of the ethical issues. So Hang Yi, over to you, and you've got 15 minutes. Thank you. Unmute yourself, Hang Yi.
Okay, so thank you very much, Charlie, for your kind introduction and also those issues you just raised. So first of all, I wanted to maybe step back a little bit to discuss about like the ChatGPT from like the input side, because mostly when people look at ChatGPT, it's much more we really care about how like the ChatGPT will affect for our life and so on and so forth. But I think people pay less attention on the input side. So as you briefly mentioned, I think that is also related to decentralized and centralized where how we deal with ChatGPT. So for example, when we think about ChatGPT, the first thing is that we know the way how they can produce those like AI generated content, no matter it's AI generated text, AI generated photo, or AI generated voice or video. It's all from like the data. So the source is very important. So here I wanted to pick up one of the issue when we talk about decentralized, when people think about the Web3, that including ChatGPT, AI, and the metaverse, people is always thinking about the decentralized society. But actually, we are going to the centralized business model. So when we think about ChatGPT, it answers almost all of like the question you can think about or you never think about. So it's much more like when you study in the university, you get your bachelor, you get your master or PhD from the top leading university, and back to 10 or 20 years ago, you can leverage what you learn and what you observe during your education. But nowadays, that is going to be belong to ChatGPT, because it simply can answer those like the question previously. Maybe you need to spend 10 or 15 years in the college, in the university, or through your tons of research study. So the point I wanted to indicate here is we need to think about when the ChatGPT can replace the role of like the human being. What kind of the role we should think about as like our career or as your business model. So I think from the personal perspective, we need to think about actually for those of like the content, how ChatGPT can learn is also produced by human being. So eventually, who owns the data issue will also come back to the discussion in AI. So it's just the same as when we discuss about financial technology. When those like the fintech company leverage our personal financial data and to detect like our personal credit or the business credit, it's the same issue. So we should not only focus it on like how the ChatGPT's output, but also how ChatGPT's input. And another perspective I also wanted to discuss with you is also about ChatGPT's input. Nowadays, when people say ChatGPT is not smart enough, meaning that ChatGPT actually they don't have enough the good learning source. They can analyze, they can put into the algorithm, they can have the better output. So how do we build up the mechanism to encourage that people is much more willing to share in their data instead of just keeping it as a secret and they just wanted to build another AI company. So I think that's something for government sector we need to think about. How do we not only work as a regulator, but much more like the facilitator to take care of each stakeholder their benefit. So perhaps we can also think about the open banking system. And that could be some idea or the concept we can borrow and introduce to the AI ChatGPT's regulation. So what is open banking? So the open banking is the idea when the financial technology was developing in the last 10 years. So as we know, in the financial industry, they also use the algorithm and artificial intelligence based on your transaction, based on how you shop online, and to have the demographic of how your credit really looks like, and based on lots of data. But we know those financial technology company, they have the good talent, they have well-established algorithm, but some of the company, they face the issue, they don't have enough data. So even they have really good algorithm can analyze those kind of statistics, but how do we encourage those the big bank, they are willing to share their data, because eventually they don't want it to compete with those startups, they still wanted to control certain of their right. So I think in this area, we can think about how do we have the open banking idea that could be open API. So for each kind of company, whenever you have the database, how could we work as a facilitator from the government side to encourage each people they are willing to share their data, and how do they transact their data under the consideration of the end users privacy and so on and so forth. So I think that is the first perspective I wanted to share to think about the input side of ChatGPT. And the second is about that Charlene raised the issue how the regulators their attitude toward the ChatGPT. As we know, when we talk about ChatGPT as regulation, people firstly think about China. As you know, ChatGPT doesn't work in China, and one of the reasons is about the national security, because we know ChatGPT is very convenient, so people they basically can just type some prompt sentence and get the information they wanted to know. But those information, whether it's really, whether it's really positive, or it could be because of the misusing of algorithm, and that's certainly some of government in the world they are caring about. So that is one of the concern for certain government like China. And the other one, recently we also noticed the country Italy, they also become the first country in Europe which wanted to ban ChatGPT. And the reason is very simple. The first one is about people's privacy, And the second is also about the transparency. So it poses the huge challenge to this kind of new industry, because if you wanted to grow bigger and become much more powerful and let ChatGPT have much more function, eventually you need to have like the economist way how you can get those data from the world. So I think both like Krish and Professor Stephen point out like they are using kind of like the cheap labor from like the developing country. So I think that's certainly one of the concern that each government should consider about. And the second, I think, is also related to the transparency of their algorithm. So whenever people search, people ask like ChatGPT to answer certain question, I think most people like you and me, probably we will believe like the answer given by the ChatGPT. And I think that's one of like the biggest issue, because eventually those like the big tycoon or like the tech company, big tech company, they wanted to misuse the technology. And I think that certainly can be like the negative side of using ChatGPT. So I think as the regulator, the first thing we need to think about is work as the facilitator. How do we encourage that ChatGPT can grow in rapidly and healthy? And secondly is that as the regulator, we also need to think about how do we strike the balance between the privacy and the efficiency. And the last part I wanted to, before I close today's my sharing perspective, I also wanted to highlight when people think about ChatGPT, it's going to replace many human beings' life. I think that's something we should take into consideration for sure. But actually, we also need to think about the lifestyle we have now is actually just not happened for so long time if we compare for the whole human being history. So let's say for people, when you are 7, you go to elementary school. When you graduate from elementary school, you go to a junior high school and a high school and then university. It's just happened in the last 100 years. So I think before 100 years ago, your ancestor maybe doesn't necessarily go to the education system. So this is like how people live, how people work, and how people make their balance of life. So I think for ChatGPT's how do we embrace ChatGPT? I think this will be the new topic. But I think for the regulator, at least I think we should not just think about the role of regulator, but also the role of facilitator. So I think because of time limitation, I think that's what I want to share temporarily. And I look forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hang Yi. That was really, really great. And I really like the point that you make between, all the tensions between privacy and efficiency, between improving people's lives, but also stunting people's lives. And that last point that you make about how education has changed people's lives only in the last 100 years. And before that, people were working the land in manual labor in a way that we forget. We have very short memories as human beings. So thank you so much for that, Hang Yi. We really appreciate that. Our final speaker is Advaitha Naidu, and I did introduce it previously, but just to say that Advaitha is a HR professional and so and is the managing director of Jackhammer Global in Africa. And she is going to speak to us a little bit about how the corporate sector is integrating AI into its plans. And Advaitha also speak to us a bit about how what is the place of critical thinking in the workplace. And yeah, we really want to hear from you. So the ethics, of course, of all of that. Thank you, Advaitha.
Thanks, Charlene. I promised Charlene at the start that I only had sort of like 9 minutes worth of content to share, but as as everyone's been talking, I've added more things. So you might actually have to hold up the flag for me. So I wish I was here as an AI expert. I'm not, but I can talk about what it means for the world of work, which Krish has touched on. I'm going to share a few key examples that I've come across in my work with various corporates, and it's really just a snapshot of how AI is manifesting in South Africa, some really practical examples. The reality is that it's been here for a long time. It's just more accessible now through this democratized access that we have to ChatGPT. And to support this assertion, I read a study that EY and Microsoft conducted with a few South African corporates as long as 4 years ago. And 80% of their respondents said that AI was already a hot topic, but only at executive level. But now we know that this conversation is happening at all levels. Partly because everyone is playing with the technology, and partly because people are starting to wonder what it means for their own jobs. But the things that we've had for a long time, chatbots, voice recognition, like mass scale tracking of customer sentiment on social media, anything that allows you to personalize your customer experience has undergone some sort of AI intervention. In our experience at Jackhammer, banking is where we've seen a lot of development. As an executive search firm, we first started handling roles that required AI expertise a lot in financial services. So on the so-called front office side, as I said, we've had chatbots for a long time, but now personalized banking is more widely available. It's on the back office, a lot of AI and machine learning investment in financial services is in detecting and preventing fraudulent transactions. So there's overall enhanced cybersecurity and anti-money laundering tools that have benefited us, but we probably just haven't seen them firsthand. A big benefit is risk reduction by virtue of better credit scoring models. You know, that's what the actuaries have been working on for a long time, but now there's more machine learning application. And then on the more complex side, there's algorithmic trading and wealth management. And I won't pretend to understand what that means, but there've been analysts and portfolio managers who've been deploying these models for years now to optimize on our investments. So there are people that are working with this technology. In the retail sector overseas, we're seeing retailers using self-checkout, but locally it's being used for supply chain optimization, for retail planning, for stock level replenishment. You know, you're looking at store level data and predicting what customer baskets are going to be in the future based on their last X number of purchases. And this precise forecasting methodology can only be good for ESG goals when you consider the reduced wastage that will hopefully result. In e-commerce, recommender engines suggest to us what products we should buy based on what's previously been on our baskets. For that matter, Netflix tells us what to watch next. Uber Eats sends us vouchers for our favorite eateries. Or maybe that's just me. I use Uber Eats a lot. In the big telcos, there's voice biometric software to handle certain types of common queries. So you don't have to sit on the phone with a call center as often or as long as you would have in the past. In one big well-known medical aid provider, we know their personalized health goals, their rewards for hitting those goals. Those have been around for years. And similar to the credit scoring models that I mentioned in banking and insurance, there's also models in place for underwriting, and so therefore quicker policy approval. The claims processes have also been automated to a degree with use of great portals. There's less paperwork, there's more digital engagement. Telehealth is also gaining traction. And then if you think about it, I mean, these are the things that we see as consumers, but even in the not so sexy sectors, the things that we don't use directly. In logistics, AI has been used to monitor carbon emission rates and for clustering of shipments and deliveries to reduce environmental strain. In mining, a lot of the application, I think, is related to process optimization and sustainability, but there's also safety enhancements. There's sensors on machinery for maintenance purposes. One company has created digital mines to do scenario testing in the virtual world before sending real life people out there and spending money on what would otherwise be possibly be a poor drilling decision. And so these are the instances in which AI has been used for business, but not really in support services like in procurement or HR. Admittedly, the adoption here has been slower because I think the assumption is that it impacts the bottom line a little bit less. That's a very mercenary approach, but probably fairly honest. But also in human resources, I mean, that really should involve human intervention, but certain systems do already exist. There's automated leave tracking or leave applicant tracking systems for new job applications, keyword searches of CVs to sift through thousands of applications, enhancing employment engagement through sentiment analysis and survey data. So if you think about the future, I mean, AI has been here for a while. And probably apart from the cases in mining and logistics, we've all been exposed to these examples that I've mentioned. But what does it mean for the future? Are we as humans at risk? And I think, yes, as everybody has said, there are certain manual and repetitive jobs which will be out-automated, but that's been the case with every single industrial revolution that the world has seen. The World Economic Forum put out a paper last year that says technology will displace 85 million jobs globally, but create 97 million new roles by 2025. And the experts, and of which I am not one, I read up on this a lot, but the experts appreciate that we don't know yet what these new jobs will be. As we saw in that first clip, prompt engineers now exist. Imagine if your daughter had told you 3 years ago that that's what she wanted to be. You know, apart, I think, from knowing that engineering was probably a safe bet, we'd otherwise have no idea what she was talking about. But what we do know is that there will definitely be enhanced need for data scientists, robotics engineers, people who can work with the technology and enhance its application for their environment to achieve competitive advantage. And importantly, I think employees need to understand that AI is an enabling capability. It enhances productivity and reduces the amount of time spent on manual tasks, allowing them to be productive and creative elsewhere. I think everyone wishes they had more time. AI can provide that time. How can we use it wisely? And then just on the topic of critical thinking, does AI actually encourage critical thinking? And I don't often agree with Gary Vaynerchuk, so my gut sense is no, it doesn't enhance critical thinking, to be honest. This is pure opinion here. In some instances, I think it will impair critical thinking. If we're constantly following what the AI tells us to do, are we actually thinking for ourselves? And I mean, just thinking about the proliferation of fake news and sharing of just the most absurd and outrageous content over the past few years. As Spider-Man teaches us, with great power comes great responsibility. And the power here is in the abundance of this data, the accessibility of it. But the responsibility is to apply the critical judgment to what we learn. As humans, we've shown that if we're presented with information that's packaged in this very pretty way, we're prone to believe it. So the first element of critical thinking relates to to bias. An algorithmic return is only as good as the data it's given in the first place. So if you're sitting in a corporate setting, and if you're getting some sort of AI insight that is completely counter to what you've experienced in that environment, you need to interrogate it further and find out why you've received that result. You cannot just blindly go with the insights generated from an AI. And another big part of critical thinking is learning from mistakes. Some of my favorite clients, the big companies, are the ones who take risks, who have this mindset of fail fast, learn quicker. They're willing to try things. They learn what works and what to improve, and then they redeploy their strategies. And they're the ones who are innovating. And it's this sort of mindset that AI can't replicate. At the end of the day, AI is here to augment human intelligence. It's not here to replicate it or to replace it. So now's the time to work on those attributes machines can't replicate. Empathy, communication skills, creative problem solving, ethics, which we've discussed, understanding context and culture. Obviously, in South Africa, this is so important. These are all the things that require deep humanity and the application of critical thinking, and why critical thinking is still so important in the workplace, and why AI won't be able to out-automate us in that sense. I think I do still have a bit of time, right? Yeah. So Thank you. So my bonus question was to talk about ethics, but if I may, I want to conflate this with some of the business risks. So, and I know we're going to get to this in the digital divide discussion, but first, let's be honest. We live in a country where unemployment rates are high. We have a lot of unions, and as we know from experience and highlighted in that digital divide video, like true understanding of what AI is pretty low. Moreover, anyone who's sitting here who's attempted to introduce something new into any environment knows that change management is hard. While people like new and shiny things, we also have a little bit of an inherent mistrust and reticence towards large-scale adoption of technology, especially technology that's hard to understand. I think Joanne posted in the chat, can the AI lead the horse to water and also make it drink? Probably not. So I think leaders need to think about whether the benefits that they're going to get from AI outweigh the risks of further disempowering our fairly fragile workforce. Another big thing is that while diffusion and proliferation are at an all-time high, the technology actually evolves so rapidly that we as users, and users are consumers ourselves, and company decision makers, we don't know just how it's going to further change and whether we have the corporate mental bandwidth or the fiscal resources to keep up with these developments, whereas labor costs, by and large, right now are predictable. Again, bias is one of the biggest risks of using AI in anything, really. Mazwi in the chat gave an example about facial recognition software and CV sorting. So the models, albeit that they're data-driven, they've been developed by humans who bring their biases and assumptions to the training of these models. These biases are magnified when the models are deployed. And if they're focusing only on historic data, and if the models aren't updated or trained with new input data, these biases are going to become more problematic. Again, the thing about understanding, there's a massive element that should be accorded, or a massive sense of importance that should be accorded to understanding. A layperson has no idea what any of this all means. So we need to find this balance between adoption and completely handing responsibility and accountability over to the machines. It's counter to customer service or employee value proposition to say, oh, well, you didn't get a raise, or we didn't give you a credit card just because the machine said so. And I think the regulatory element Marina mentioned in the chat, globally, we've seen limited government and watchdog bodies get involved. But in the South African context, like the ethics or the regulations about POPI and anti-competitive behavior, we know that that's taken pretty seriously. I think we're going to see more companies taking quite a circumspect approach to large-scale AI adoption before firing half their workforce in order to operationalize. In an ideal world, what they'd be doing in the interim is upskilling people on the new tech to begin with. But, well, I don't run a JSE listed company, so I can't say that for sure.
Advisor, I'm sure you could go on, and thank you so much for all thank you for all of those really good business use examples. I think that's really helpful for us to draw a bridge between the past and the present, and to show how so many of those innovations have been coming, but now they're on a kind of a speed curve almost, going forward. I think that's really, really important. My notes, I've already got 2 or 3 pages of notes, and I really would like to invite comments from the audience, and you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll ask you to articulate your question. I think the thing that's really important for me is there's so many questions that we've asked already through the presentation of the panelists, but there's also other questions. And at the bottom line for me as a researcher who's concerned about young people and the future of work, about the education of young people in this country, but also on the continent and the global south, is how does this all affect young people who are already marginalized by the digital divide, young people in rural areas who don't have access to smartphones, who don't have access to data because of poverty, and who don't have access to the energy needed to charge their smartphone or their laptop, and who are in schools where teachers are afraid of the new technologies, right? So those are some of the big questions that are kind of an overarching ethical question. And then on the other hand, there's this question around how is AI going to affect our humanity or the survival of humanity? That's a very big question. And I know, Stephen, I want to hear something about that from you. And then in the chat, there have been questions around which countries are actually enacting laws, and apparently it's only 3 so far. And it's a little bit like crypto, in my understanding. You know, crypto was very slow to be regulated, and in fact still hasn't been regulated in many places around the world. And partly because our policymakers aren't always the ones who understand it. And I have a feeling it's going to be the same with AI. I know that when I speak to some people in the policymaking spaces, they still say, ChatGPT, what? Because it's not something that everybody in every generation are going to jump onto. I think people of my generation and younger over the last few months have jumped onto it, you know, in a really big way. And then there are the naysayers who will say, well, ChatGPT just lies to you all the time. And that's true. We know that as the 3.5 to 4, so somebody once said ChatGPT is a little bit like a very quick research assistant who sometimes lies to you. But the rejoinder is, the more I prompt it, the better questions I ask it, the less it lies to me. And the more I put it through, you know, its steps to get better responses, which is why I really like the Wakanda quote. My AI, says Shuri about Griot in Black Panther, is only as good as the questions that I ask it, as what I tell it to do. So, colleagues, that's just to say thank you to our panelists, but now I really want to hear a couple of questions, and please won't you raise your hand. And Chris, you can also just help me go back through the chat to see if there's any other questions that we can ask our panelists to answer. But yeah, please raise your hand and I'll give you an opportunity. Is everybody stunned into silence by all of that input? Stephen, let me ask you to go ahead so far. And then Peter, Herman, go ahead, Stephen. Unmute yourself. You see, no matter how clever we are, we still don't know where the mute button is. Sorry.
There are a lot of questions sitting in the meeting chat. I've just been scrolling through a couple of them, but I wanted to respond to something you said, and I wanted to respond to one comment that I saw on the chat. So the first thing I want to respond to is what is known as the hallucinations, which is when the chatbot responds with something not factual, but sometimes completely irrational and hallucinatory. And there's a reason for that, is that the entire basis of the plumbing of ChatGPT and the other large language models is statistical. It's a statistical inference engine. And when you have statistics, you have a bell curve, and there are some things that sit at the end of that distribution curve which are not necessarily rational or don't sound rational. ChatGPT 4 is 80% better than ChatGPT 3.5 at filtering out wrong answers, and ChatGPT 5 will get it almost perfect. So that's a problem that's going away. It is only because this is such an early stage of development. The comment that I saw going by as I've been scrolling through these many comments is that AI doesn't do anything new. It just collects data and it is able to answer something in the same realm. That is not a correct statement. The entire point of ChatGPT, or of the large language models, I don't want to use them, there are many others. By the way, for those of you who don't know, there's Google's Bard, there's NVIDIA, there's Adobe, there's DeepMind Sparrow, there's Anthropic's Claude. There are lots of these things coming up. There's Stanford's Alpaca. The entire point of these models is that they do things that are completely and utterly novel, and not from the same realm as where you ask them the questions. So what these things have attempted to do was suck in the entire corpus of human knowledge. Of course, they haven't managed yet, because there's stuff under copyright and there's stuff that's not on the web. But just in principle, they're sucking in every single piece of text that they can get their hands on from the history of recorded of record. And they are drawing statistical relationships between things in this massive storage of data. And what they are outputting is completely novel and completely new. And I urge you to play around with stuff with long, complicated questions, and you will be utterly astonished at how novel and new the stuff is that comes out of its digital mouth.
Thank you, Stephen. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I may sound skeptical and negative about it, but I'm definitely not. In order to still to make it clear for me is, I agree there is something entirely new with all this, but I think at the same time we still have to ask the old questions. And the old questions are often forgotten. I don't say always forgotten, are often forgotten, I think, and had never been answered, and will probably, they won't be answered at any stage. So with simple things, I just look for the last chat entry. I think that's no question about this. That's an easy thing to solve, probably by AI. But if I look at what Krish said in the beginning, he mentioned the GDP growth. Should we still think about GDP as relevant measurement, as relevant standard? So this is the fear I have, that we are kind of shifting between what is new, what is old, applying what worked in some way, making more effective by new means, without considering the fundamental, if you want, fundamental questions, the superhuman, which had been mentioned. Do we need superhumans in terms of technical invention, or should we, and there I see as well a huge opportunity for the application of AI, for the application of AI, to say we educate humans to be more super, if you want, to be more human, to be more humane, with the help of AI, but not to, and this is always a little bit coming with it, not trying to improve, well, to perfect it. We are not perfect. I think we have to accept this, and we have to look for ways of dealing with the problem. And there I have a little bit of a problem with what you said, Stephen, in the major contribution. Not everybody has the same ethical approach as we have. Who says that we have, who are we? Who says that we have the correct one, or the right one, or whatever? This was actually the reason for writing about Elon Musk. He is one of us, I guess. He just doesn't take care of entire region in Germany, building up his enterprise, letting alone that he looks for batteries that are definitely not sustainable, that do huge harm to countries, to other countries. So
Yes.
all questions not solved.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for those provocations. Elizabeth, I'm going to hand over to you to ask your question.
I think I want to clarify something. I mean, we've been speaking about how correct or accurate ChatGPT is, and let's just use that as an example of AI that most people are aware of. The problem is that who decides what is correct? If we look at science, it's about what the consensus is at any given time, and that changes as we research new things and find new things. So if ChatGPT ran 400 years ago, the earth was flat. And that's the answer. And everyone would say it is correct. It is only as intelligent as the data that's been fed into it. And that's the basis of its thinking, if you like. So when I say that it can't really generate anything new, it can only extrapolate from what it has. So very much in terms of the questions that we ask, it's those questions that generate something new. We are asking it to make connections in new ways, but it cannot move beyond that at this stage. Now, the big problem here is similar to what we have with the Google bubble. So as you search things on Google, it learns what you search, and it's more likely to return the same sort of information. So for instance, like vaccinations and the possibility of disease occurring because of that. The more you search for that, the more you'll get for that. If you are a Republican and you support Trump, you're more likely to get information relating to that because of the pattern that you have. So the more we search in or ask ChatGPT certain questions, the more data generates which feeds back into ChatGPT. Any bias that's in there will be exacerbated. If we look at Twitter and Tay, for instance, which was an artificial intelligence that they created on Twitter, it took 24 hours for Tay to turn into a racist, anti-Semitic bully, and they had to actually pull it. If we want to talk about ethics, we cannot talk about the ethics of, let's take something basic, which ChatGPT is. Take something quite basic like that, and we say, well, we don't actually know what the training data set is. Ethics is relative. What are the ethics and the rules that have been incorporated there? What sort of human interaction is there? If we want to talk ethics, we have to know what these underlying aspects are. So if we talk about ethics and working with AI, as researchers, the ethics then becomes that you have to be knowledgeable about any tool that you are using. And you have to remain accurate with that as the learning continues, as new things are being generated, not just outside, but by the tool itself. And I mean, a very easy example of that is, and this is quite a well-known study, where they were using AI to identify skin cancer. And all of a sudden, an AI is actually supposed to be very accurate and good with this. But what happened is it falsely identified things as not being skin cancer. And this was consistent. And it turns out the problem was with the training data set. Anytime there was skin cancer present, because it was a medical image, it had a ruler there to measure the size of the mole. Therefore, the AI decided the most prominent indicator of whether or not there is skin cancer is whether or not there's a ruler in the image. Very basic, very straightforward, large amount of money expended over here, but there was a mistake in the training data set. So I don't believe that AI can be correct, because what is correct? It is a consensus. So more information out there saying a certain thing, and it's more likely to say something that's been historically accurate. With ChatGPT, for instance, more about things that happened before 2021 than what is happening now.
Elizabeth, I mean, that's a really good input. Maybe you can just tell us who you are, please. And I'm going to ask Peter to do the same, because I think that'll just also help us to kind of broaden the network and the conversation beyond this dialogue.
Yeah, I'm Liz Archer. I'm from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, in Cape Town.
And what is your, what do you do at UWC? What is your interest?
I'm the Director for Institutional Research. So we work with strategy and planning in higher education and research around the university and the students, alumni, etc.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. And that's just your input has been a really good example of the critical thinking that is needed around adopting AI in any context. So thank you for that input. That's really helpful. Peter, why don't you just tell us who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, well, I'm currently in Germany, but I'm working for the Human Rights Center in Shanghai in China. It's a law institute, part of the law department.
Okay,
I'm
great.
a researcher there.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Colleagues, did I see any other hands? Any other comments? Krish, are there any other questions in the chat?
The chat was buzzing quite a lot earlier. Perhaps we can invite Maria Yudina to share some of her thoughts. She was quite active in the chat.
Maria, would you like to talk to us a little bit about some of your comments in the chat?
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Maria Yudina. I'm from Russia, Moscow HSRC University. It's High School of Economics. I'm from laboratory which deals with digital transformation for civil services, government, and etc. So I was buzzing in the chat because I'm usually a writer person. Only can thank you all speakers, because it was great. It was very helpful. So many insights. I'm applaud to the organizers. I never saw anyone so brilliantly presenting using fragments of other people's videos. Krish, it was unique experience for me. I was on so many conferences during my career, and you were the first one who was bold enough to do it this way. It was quite unusual. Yes, usually my inputs more or less about AI ethics, and actually already made my question in chat to the Stephen Sidley, because he said something about that there is no regulation of this topic in Russia. Actually, it is not true. We actually do have some law about digital ethics, but the problem with all Russian laws is about the
implementation
in practice. Yes. Yeah. I guess it's not only a Russian problem, but Russia is famous for having laws which are not go into practice or used on people who have less resources, you know. General inequality problem, I feel that. And you're talking about bad guys, maybe that's not more about politicians these days, because they usually are not so, you know, qualified. For me, bad guys are those in the shadows or in big tech companies who close ethical committees like Microsoft did recently. There was a big news that they just, oh, we don't need this ethical committee. Why we spend some money on this ethical specialist? We need to go forward. We need to be better than China. China is on the rise in economical sense of AI. So forget about ethics. We need to go forward. We need to advance quicker. We have to win. So for me, it is the main problem with digital ethics, that countries are usually go into the national interests. So they're afraid to lose some credits, some economical advantages. So they prefer to forget about ethics, like it's something not so important, or we can think about it later. We have to win now, and that's the main problem I see here in this department. As a sociologist and PhD in sociological sciences, it's my view on this variety of problems.
Yeah. Maria, just to ask you a direct question, has Russia banned any AI like ChatGPT, like China has done or like Italy has done? Have they, I mean, I know you said that they've removed the need for ethical committees in some places, but have they done any kind of broad banning?
You know, funny thing is, we actually, our government banned some technologies like VPN services, you know, VPN, and still when you use internet, when you use smartphones, you go some sites that friendly tell you, please turn off your VPN. It might be not useful for you in using our service. So there is a law who abandons something, bans. There is a ban, but people are like already don't care about it. So ChatGPT, I'm as a researcher want to use ChatGPT, but I can't I have no access to it. Do politics or others, I don't know why. So I'm watching on conferences how Krisha used ChatGPT, and I said, okay, it would be nice if I have a phone number to register in it and use it for scientific reasons, for solving social problems, inequality questions asking. But I can do it. I'm from Russia. I don't have the rights to do so.
Yeah.
So I can only watch how you talk about it and using it in practice, and feel sorry for myself that I can't actually try it on my computer.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria. Go ahead, Stephen, and then Advaita
I wanted to respond to Maria, since it was my comment that she picked up on. I didn't mean to imply that there weren't digital ethic rules in place. I was trying to make the broader point, Maria, that there are ethical differences between different cultures which are unbridgeable. And I'm going to give you a simpler example where it actually exists in Africa. If there is a corpus of writing which has been ingested by one of these large language models, it will also ingest, as part of that knowledge, for instance, the history of the LGBT community, whereas in the 1800s and 1700s and before, it was not a major issue. It is a major issue now in the 21st century, where LGBT rights have sort of flamed up and been embedded in certain countries. There are other countries, we have some here in Africa, I'm not sure whether it's Uganda or Ghana, where it is illegal to declare yourself as an LGBT person, and not only in Africa, in conservative religious countries in the Middle East as well. You will never be able to bridge that. So what are you going to tell a global AI system like ChatGPT when it expresses an opinion about the LGBT community? There is no solution to that problem. And I'll go back again with other global frameworks and guidance. United Nations has always been the place to do that, which is why mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons worked for so long, because it was in everybody's interest to sign that. It is not in everybody's interest to sign a disrespect of LGBT or a respect of LGBT.
I see your point, yes. Thank you.
So, colleagues, are there other comments or questions?
Masvi had a question or raised a few comments in the chat about the ethics issue. You were talking about the biases that these systems have, particularly with some systems not being able to correctly identify darker colored skins. Masvi, perhaps you want to expand on that point? If she's still here. Masvi Matabula. There's another hand from Elizabeth.
Yes, I think what's being referred to is actually something that came up with digital proctoring systems that grew during assessments in COVID with online assessments, but also identification of passports and people at airports. And what was done was different images were used of people of different races and genders to see how accurate it was to identify people according to their photos. And they tested 998 algorithms, if I'm not mistaken. And of those algorithms, at worst, the computer in the algorithm was 100 times more likely to misidentify a person of dark skin color than a white person. There's also differences in terms of Asian people and people from the from the West. So yeah, that's another point of contention. And even lighting plays a role in something like this. And of course, if you change your hairstyle. So there is a racial bias in photo identification algorithms. They are just not capable at this point to be unbiased.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Daniel, you also want to make some points about the problem is being more society and leadership rather than AI itself. Maybe speak more to that and ask your question if you have one. But also tell us who you are, Daniel.
Hi. Okay. I'm Daniel. I work at Nedbank as a senior quantitative analyst. I did an engineering degree and a master's in finance. I will touch on that if you want, but I kind of wanted to get another point across, which is I feel like a lot of the problems that people are bringing up in this forum are problems that we are quite well aware of, and anybody that is, creating a company within this space is definitely aware of and are trying to actively fix. To me, I'd rather encourage the forum to think a step or two further down the line, because I think that's where things get really difficult. And I'll give you an example. Labor work, hard labor work in Europe, for example, is quite a well-paying job because there's very low supply of hard laborers in Europe compared to a place like South Africa where labor is actually very cheap. And so if you take something like Boston Dynamics, who has made huge advances on the kind of hardware side of things, creating robots that can do many different things, and then the combination of ChatGPT, LLMs, it has plugins to Wolfram Alpha, which means that it will be able to do kind of mathematical models, etc. as well. So you've got the brain of these robots and you've got the hardware of the Boston Dynamic robots, and you put them together and you get a skilled laborer that can build houses, whether it's raining and storming, whether it's through the night with night vision, with precision accuracy. They never need to take breaks, lunch breaks. They don't need to have leave, etc. And the incentives are all there for, a continent like Europe to do this because it's just so much cheaper and there's really not that many people that they will displace by doing it. But it's a completely different story for South Africa. So the point is, it's coming, whether you like it or not, because there's incentives aligned for it to come. So we need to start questioning, what happens when it does. So just finishing off the point, there is going to be one or two companies or maybe three companies out there that become huge juggernauts, where they make so much money, it's going to challenge nation states' GDPs on an order of magnitude. And the question is, how does it make sense? You can't have people that are just ridiculously rich, trillionaires. So you need to maybe create some sort of system where it's decided up front now, which is why we need to have these discussions, that if such a company does exist, there needs to be a dividend payout to those that are displaced, for example, every year. So as the company makes money, it gets put into the hands of those that are displaced. I think Krish might have a question, but yeah.
I think you might have a response, but thank you, Daniel. That's a great point. Krish?
Yes, I do have a response. Probably Stephen might want to jump in after me as well. But I wanted to just bring your attention to a blog post that was written by Sam Altman last year, 2021 actually. And he called it the Moore's Law of everything. And so if anybody knows what Moore's Law is, it was that processing power was doubling, I think, every 2 years or so. And so computers were getting better and cheaper as it goes along. And Sam Altman makes the argument that labor and knowledge work, the cost of that is actually going to start to decrease over time. And so we're going to get to a point where these sorts of things are actually how did he describe it? He said it's going to reach, the cost is going to reach near zero. And it's going to be these assets, these robots that are both able to do the hard labor and do the knowledge work that are going to be the engines of productivity. And so he argued that we should be taxing the owners of the asset. If the asset is producing the income, then we should be raising taxes from that. But then when I read that article, it seemed that he didn't quite grasp the whole issues that relate to inequality and what a country like South Africa will experience, where who is it that actually owns those assets right now? it's the big corporates. And so are we saying it's the big corporates are going to be responsible for all of human productivity, and the rest of us, then, I don't know, we start to read books or think about our spirituality and not actually contribute to global productivity. So if the means of production is going to start getting cheaper and better, how do we diffuse that across society so that everybody has that opportunity to contribute and have a share of ownership in those systems? I think those are the questions that we need to get to grips with.
And I think what you're raising, Krish, is that there are other big, very complex ethical issues that talk to the nature of capitalism, the nature of economics in the world. And we're not the first people that are going to be raising these questions around AI. We've always been having them because of the inequality divide. Joanne, you had your hand up and I see you've put it down, but do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Thank you, Charlene. I'm just a humble public servant, so I didn't have the resume of some of the other speakers. One thing that just strikes me, and this is obviously a public good finger pointing at research institutions, is that the quality of the data on which all of these applications, and these are just advancements on problems we've had as human beings for centuries, is that really good data becomes hard to come by. It's mostly expensive if one has to look at, publicly accessible data that really can deliver value. You're not going to find a whole lot of it on the open market. When you start looking at quality data, you're looking at the HSRC and them needing to make money to do the research. So for me, that is a bigger problem than a lot of the software or the applications, because that's a problem that we can't solve with technology, because as many of the speakers have said, the quality you put into software like this, the quality of your base information is going to determine the quality that comes out. And if the quality of these systems is going to be only really good once you get inside an institute like the HSRC with their fantastic collection of research, but which is inaccessible to the average Joe because of the costs required. And we understand the need to pay for research, but we need a stronger lobby on making quality research more accessible to people who are going to need to use it. And we were involved in a lot of studies during COVID as government, obviously because of the need for behavior change. And what we found was there were a lot of areas that we need data in, but that are not really where research is not funded because it's not kind of in the interest of upper echelons of society. So people don't really care whether a man in a township is not accessing his free vaccination because he doesn't have the money to travel to a clinic which doesn't vet him based on his appearance, or it's just information that we don't bother to collect because when it is collected, it has to be paid for, and it doesn't necessarily build a body of socially useful information. And I know that the institutes try hard. I'm not gunning for them on that. I'm gunning for the fact that we don't have good quality data, free and accessible.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and there's certainly kind of a global move towards open access of knowledge and kind of open publishing, but it's not yet gone far enough. Before you jump off, Jane, why don't you just tell us what department you're from in government and what your role is?
I'm from National Department of Government Communications, and I report to a unit known as Policy and Research.
Okay, great, thank you. So, colleagues, we kind of coming towards, we want to wrap up and give back to Krish to take us through some of the suggestions that have come out of the seminar in order for us to think more about our own research agenda. But I do want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to answer this question that for me is kind of the burning question. How do we overcome this digital divide that we are also kind of, running towards in South Africa, on the African continent, in the global South, when it comes to the adoption of new technologies such as AI and how it's become so accessible to some of us. So Hangi, would you like to kick that off? And then Advaitha, and then Stephen, and then I'm going to hand back to Krish to tell us a little bit about what we've generated in terms of our research agenda. Hangi?
Sure. So I think from my side, in terms of the potential research agenda that could be taken into consideration, I think that will be the role of government. How could the government could be the facilitator? So as like the audience, they raise the question, how do we have the good quality data? So really that government need to think about the mechanism, how could we facilitate and to encourage those organization or institute who owns the data is willing to share, and to share to what kind of extent. For example, do they have the right to decide whether they wanted to share or not? Or is it like the obligation, and in what kind of category of data they should consider to share? So as I briefly mentioned in the panel discussion, I think that we can borrow the open banking concept of fintech. That some governments and jurisdiction, they also force like those big banks to share those data for like the fintech company under the permission of the user. They can use their data. So eventually, we need to think about how do we deal with that triangle relationship between the end user and also like the OpenAI, this kind of algorithm company, and also the government sector. So I think only like this, we can ensure that we also keep the privacy, but also to prevent this kind of company become super centralized. Because one of the things when Krish and I, we had a discussion back to a couple of weeks ago, we were thinking nowadays people still can change their life or change their fortune because they study very hard, they get the good degree. But what happens if ChatGPT really can become very centralized and like the knowledge company? So whenever that company wanted to hire people, maybe they wouldn't pay money to hire us, but they will much more willing to pay money to hire ChatGPT. So I think that's something maybe government can think about their role about the facilitator. So that's something I wanted to share.
Great. Thank you very much, Hangi. Advaitha?
Honestly, I really hate these type of questions because I'm the type of person who wants to talk about very practical things. And this is an issue that obviously requires a very macro, almost philosophical view. But my high level takeaway is that it obviously requires a partnership approach. You know, there's the government and the policymakers. Obviously, policy needs to be put in place to address the affordability aspect. But as Yaku said in the chat, global policies are not going to work. Our unique environment requires very localized solutions and policies. With the educational institutions, so many schools still take that approach that Gary Vaynerchuk mentioned. You know, you're trained to memorize things. We're not being taught critical thinking at an early enough level. And suddenly kids get to university and their minds are blown because, you know, suddenly they're doing this critical thinking course rather than it being baked into the way they approach problems early on in life. So I think the future proofing of our children really starts much earlier than that. the Partnership for Corporate South Africa, are companies doing enough to not only upskill current employees, but are they future planning for what's next and investing into developing communities? And then for the new and emerging companies, the companies that are moving quickly, they're digital first. I think this is what Daniel was referring to when he said these juggernauts that are going to make these massive amounts of money. They're the ones showing us early on what's next. And instead of going off and developing ChatGPT in the background and then launching it to the masses without consultation and then being begged to halt development for 6 months, they should really be working in partnership in an ecosystem to consider all the eventualities. This is sort of like risk, understanding of risk and context. The eventualities of what it means when they develop this technology. But again, come back to the philosophical questions, I think, as with most global movements, who takes responsibility? Who ensures that our agenda is the same, that we're all pulling at the same velocity? I think that's for people at the HSRC to help us with.
Thanks very much, Adwaita. Stephen?
Yeah, just let me get my camera on over here. Thank you. Just before I address your question, there were two very meaty comments there at the end from Daniel and Joanne. I'm sorry, I think it was Joanne who was the last person. Daniel, I see it differently. I think there's actually not going to be a consolidation. I think there's going to be a fracturing of this industry into many different, very deep and narrow shards. And I'll give you one example. There is all of the big guys like Google and Meta and Microsoft and all those guys who are trying to do a big wide thing and trying to own the large language model for general intelligence, where the real interesting stuff is happening is in narrow intelligence. And I'll give you an example of one, which is Bloomberg, certainly not a small company, but not as big as the other ones, who have just released Bloomberg GPT. Now, Bloomberg GPT only has financial data. There's another one that is underway in the medical world. I've forgotten in which particular branch of medicine, which is a large language model that is dealing only with an area of medical research and application. So I think you're going to see thousands and thousands and thousands of LLMs that are applied to narrow areas, which addresses Joanne's problem, is that a lot of this data is hidden. In Bloomberg's case, you had to pay a lot of money to get hold of the data that they have, which is all the annual reports going back hundreds of years, and financial data and time series data and that sort of stuff. It'll now be available at very low cost to people through Bloomberg GPT. So the two conclusions I wanted to make is that the data problem solves itself when there is a way to monetize at a lower amount that one has been able to do previously. And number two, I think we're going to fracture into many, many artificial narrow intelligences. So we don't get the same story that we have now in search or social media. To directly question, how do we conquer what you see as a digital divide coming at us? I think it's going the other way, Charlene. If you remember when cell phones came out in the 1990s in South Africa, and people looked at this thing and they said, well, this is only going to be a very small market of people who have got university degrees because this interface is so complicated and they can't afford it and what. And of course, now you have 60 million cell phones in South Africa. I have an example of somebody who works in my home who is unable to read properly and unable to speak English very well, who is just as efficient as I am on this machine. There is no digital divide when people need to use something. There is a digital divide in cost, clearly. She can't afford an iPhone, so she has one of the 1,200 Rand Android phones. She can't afford as much data as I can afford, but she can use her machine. I watched her this morning. She's much faster than I am, and she uses advanced apps like WhatsApp and photography, and is completely proficient at moving around there. So the second issue is why I think the digital divide starts to dissolve in this industry is the digital divide was defined, was exemplified, is a better word, by the fact that interfaces are difficult to use, a lot of them, okay? They're clunky and you've got to understand password and remember it, and you can't get through the interface and APIs, and there's all these words. People, like my elderly relatives just don't want to touch this thing because there's all this jargon. The whole point about this AI thing is you talk to it in your home language, and you talk to it in the vernacular, and you get the results that you want. That is an anti-digital divide technology.
Wow. Thank you, Stephen. And Paladi in Makhlala has just said something about, bridging it or widening it and thinking about rural areas that are not able to fully compete in this area. And I think that that's really important, is that we are so poor at predicting the future and how uptake is going to happen. But it doesn't stop us from, in a sense, trying really hard and keeping it front and center, that the ways in which the technology unfolds, we need to always think about people who are unable or don't want to adopt it, and what it will do to them and their livelihood and their humanity. Because I think that's been, Advaitha, you kind of raised it as part of the philosophical conversation. But what is it that we're trying to do here? Are we trying to compete, or are we trying to collaborate? Because for me, one of the really important pieces that Eliezer raises is this issue around, if we are competing with each other to see who gets the biggest economic output from this new technology, and we're on a road to self-destruction, well, that's one thing. Can we collaborate? Has the history of the world shown how it's possible to collaborate? Yes and no, because we aren't all kind of angels, but is there the angels of our better nature that we can appeal to? So if I were to summarize, that would be something around collaboration and competition. But Daniel, you really want to say something, and I'm sure it's in response to Stephen. And then Krish, I'm going to hand over to you. Daniel?
Yeah, you're right. Look, I already said in the chat, but I want Stephen's attention because I enjoy that little debate. I think initially it will be exactly as he said. Initially, there'll be a bunch of spin-offs from ChatGPT where they use kind of their own unique data and build deep knowledge within specific domains. But then, shortly after, you just create another large language model that learns how to prompt these different narrow and deep LLMs. And that one will be your central Google, if you want to take it with that analogy, because Google obviously is a search engine that we pretty much all use, but there's plenty of content creators out there that is what we ultimately trying to get to, but it's just Google that is redirecting us there. So yes, agreed, initially decentralized, but it could end up being super centralized, and there should still be giant juggernauts that arise.
Peter, one last comment from you before I hand back to Krish, because I love the fact that we can keep going forever, but I do want us to hand back to Krish, because I want us to say that this has been more than just a dialogue, a talk shop. We want to have learned ourselves as the Human Sciences Research Council about kind of our next steps in terms of AI. But Peter, just a short comment from you.
Yeah, it may well link to cooperation and to what Stephen said. In the medical area, you said we will have a kind of ChatGPT there. In the medical area, I think we see exactly the problematic of not cooperating. We replace, in many cases, medical knowledge, hand it over to artificial intelligence. And if I look at what happens in the medical sector, medical staff don't know what they are doing anymore. They don't cooperate with each other. It's specialized, it's specified, it's differentiated, and they don't cooperate with other sections, with other areas that are relevant for medical areas, for internationally, and so on and so forth. So that's a word of caution, I think.
Great, thank you. Krish, I know you've only got a few minutes, but let's see what we've learned about our own research agenda from today's dialogue.
Yes, thank you, Charlene. It's a very stimulating discussion, and I've been keeping an eye on the chat, particularly as it was buzzing earlier during the presentations, and there were a few points that were raised about new potential projects that we could add. So I'll share my screen now. But I just wanted to say, touching on what Stephen said about the Bloomberg GPT and the medical GPT that's coming, those are the sorts of ideas that people have seen in their own unique spaces where they say, wow, I could take this GPT model and I could apply it on my knowledge base and I could do some really fantastic things. And can then just imagine how much more powerful this will make Bloomberg once they feed in it decades and decades worth of financial data. So here in the HSRC, we're in a similar position that we have a plethora of knowledge that we've produced. But we now need to be able to draw some insights from it and these sorts of tools to make that possible. So yeah, so those are the types of ideas that we're looking for. But where can we take this, put it on top of something, and build something new? And that's where we're going. So I've tried to write this prompt. Now I'm preparing for ChatGPT. We don't know what's going to come out of ChatGPT. It's a bit of an adventure now, but in terms of where the research agenda could go, I've asked it to write a. Sorry, my screen is just a little. Write a detailed research and development project plan for the HSRC in South Africa, hoping that it knows who the HSRC in South Africa is, that applies generative AI APIs, application programming interfaces from OpenAI and elsewhere, assuming that there are other APIs that we could take advantage of. For the South African public, for each deliverable, describe what the tool should do and provide a brief explanation on how to produce whatever the tool is, using a software architect, a research and development assistant, a junior programmer, and ChatGPT as the senior pair programmer, because we want to bring in somebody who's perhaps got a little bit some software development skills, but they will work with the technology to extend their abilities. And then I ask you to identify short, medium, and long-term deliverables for each suggested AI service that I've listed. So those potential services, the first two are ones that we've discussed already. One is the research chatbot informed by the HSRC knowledge output knowledge base. The second being the policy chatbot. Then there were 4 other ideas that came up, and I've been trying to phrase that idea. So please, if I've botched your point, please jump in. I might not be able to see your hands in the participants window, but please do just shout out and just let me know if I've captured it correctly. But the first one was, we were saying, let's build a system that defines solutions to narrow the digital gap specifically for Pretoria in South Africa. Identify solutions which will work better for Pretoria than Russia. So that was giving some sort of background to it. So I've tried to just say, when you're talking about a system, are we talking about a chatbot? I just wanted some clarity there. I'm going to go with chatbot if I don't hear anything. And instead of saying just Pretoria, I think maybe what you're talking about there is something that applies to the local government level. So
yes, I guess yes, of course, something about the government level. And just the whole idea was to not give this ChatGPT too easy question to ask. You know, try to make it more concrete question, like differentiation between countries and maybe levels of government, etc.
Do you see it as a chatbot, something that you speak to, you give it a prompt and it comes back to you, but it's defined with the local context of Pretoria in this case, but any particular...
Yes, different let's the program try to differentiate between 2 countries and to ask the question the way it have to see differences between digital divides in South Africa and Russia, as for example.
Okay, so we're looking for solutions that apply to a local government, a local municipality,
yes,
but
yes.
we want to contrast that experience with perhaps something from the developed world using Russia as
yes.
Okay,
as
I've
a
got
part
you.
of the development.
Okay, so I'm going to say that's a chatbot that defines solutions to narrow the digital gap. Focus on the local context, focus on solutions for a local municipality. A local municipality. Identify which solutions work better for the local municipality and compare their experiences to an inputted developed country. Okay, that's the one. The next one was build a system which provides advice on how to change human behavior and to ensure that the laws are complied with, lives are respected, and then environments and climate change are then linked in the minds of the public. Like any good chatbot, I don't provide any sources, so I can't remember who actually wrote this comment. If someone is still on with us, have I captured it correctly? Have I got the point of what you wanted to ask?
It was Joanne. And you have, but I think it may be a complex question, because I think the basic question is we're looking for advice on levers to change human behaviors to be more compliant to laws. So I think
And do you see that also as a chatbot? Do you see that as a chatbot, that someone works with a tool, or do you want to go to a website that has a list of possible levers?
Yes, one would want to go to a website that has possible levers.
Build a website that identifies the levers of change.
Of behavior change, because
Of
levers of
behavioral
change must behavioral change.
To ensure that laws are complied with.
Yes.
Okay. Lives are respected, and I think that all gives more context to the initial prompt, so that can still be useful. Yeah, then the next one was build a
Chris,
community.
sorry, to just take out the to ensure, that to ensure. There's just a bit of double speak. I know that it ignores it when your grammar is poor. So to ensure.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. My eyes aren't as fast as yours.
Also, between 0.4 and 5, you have touch on mine, which is the build a system, convert a book into a slideshow movie.
Ah, yes, my numbering is off. Would you like to speak to that now while you're on the floor?
Well, I mean, I gave a bit more specific instructions. It should kind of pass a book into visual cues and then throw those visual cues into Midjourney to generate those images.
Pause, P-A-R-S-E, Krish.
Yeah.
I'm exposing myself here.
No, it's okay. This is quite exciting. So we all agog.
Produce visual outputs using Midjourney.
Yeah.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah. So rather write pass the text in the book. Pass the text in the book or from. Okay. Yeah. It's fine, but just maybe take away the in. I mean, ChatGPT will probably know what you're trying to say anyway.
Take away the
after pause.
Yeah.
There we go.
Pass the text. Yes. Okay. Anything more you want to add to that?
No, that's fine.
Got it. I think I skipped the old. I know we covered that actually. Next one: build a community-specific chatbot informed by knowledge outputs generated by the community itself. I think might have butchered somebody's point. I was taking something from the chat and I restructured it here.
It just sounds a little bit generic, Krish. That's why. So I'm not sure who wrote that, whether they want to maybe add a bit more specific.
See if
Well, wait. Can I be a little bit more specific about mine? Can you pass the text into visual cues? Because otherwise it's just going to pass every single word.
Pass the text and produce visual cues.
Yeah, pass the text into visual cues from the inputted book. Yeah, that's how it would work. Thank you.
Okay, got it.
Krish, I don't see anybody putting their hand up about the community-specific chatbot, but I do remember speaking to a woman who was trying to sell a community discussion platform for job creation, and she tested it in Limpopo, so that might be a good example. So the community of a particular region in Limpopo was generating information about job opportunities and how people could get into a particular field if they didn't have the training, and where they could find and apply for the jobs and so on.
Okay, so it's information that people are aware of, but perhaps not necessarily documented, specific to Limpopo.
She was using a WhatsApp group where people in the local authorities would place work and say, if you don't have the following qualifications, here is a training institution that you can apply to that will boost your knowledge. Or it was kind of a by word of mouth job finding.
Okay, I think that's enough, Krish, for that line.
Okay, and then the last one, build an AI system that identifies where new research questions are duplicated in previous research. This can be linked to issues of vaccine hesitancy, diseases, epidemiology, and other areas of research.
Okay.
It's very medical oriented, but I think that could be applied across the board, where you want a quick system to say, has this piece of work actually been done before? Would I be working on something new?
So Krish, run it.
Okay, so that's our prompt. I'm going to jump over to my GPT-4 account on ChatGPT, drop it in, and run. Title: AI-powered services for the South African Public Organization, Human Sciences Research Council. Introduction: the R&D project plans to apply generative AI APIs, such as those provided by OpenAI, to develop various AI services that can address public concerns. And then it talks about the team, and then it says the plan is divided into short, medium, and long-term deliverables. Short-term deliverables, telling us this should work in 3 to 6 months. The research chatbot gives me the objective. How to produce: the team will develop a custom API that utilizes ChatGPT and OpenAI's knowledge base while integrating the HSRC's research outputs. The junior programmer will work on the user interface while the research and development assistant will compile the knowledge base. Well, that's basically what I had in mind, so it's already on the same train of thought that I had. Government policy chatbot, explore policy gaps, misalignments. How to produce: the team will use similar approach to the research chatbot, will focus on collecting and integrating education policy data, gives roles for the research assistant and the junior programmer who will work on the interface. Medium-term deliverables: digital gap solutions chatbot. Okay, interesting. Why I chose to put that in the medium term, not in the short term. Objective: define solutions to narrow the digital gap. How to produce: the team will develop a chatbot that uses generative AI to analyze user input, assess local municipality data, and compare with developed countries. And then it gives roles for the research assistant and the junior programmer. Behavioral change website. Identify the levers for behavioral change. How to produce: the team will use generative AI to analyze relevant data and identify behavioral change strategies. And then it gives roles for the architect and the junior programmer. So each of these could be extended. You could dig into them, drill in, expand that point. What should this person do? When should that person do it? And so on. Book to slideshow converter. Oh, this is in the long term. Convert books into a visual slideshow. Team will develop a custom AI algorithm that can interpret text and generate visual representations that will work on the system user's interface. And then it gives a role for the assistant who will test the system and provide various book inputs. Community-specific chatbot. Let me just write continue before I go on so it can finish what it had started. A community-specific chatbot. Create a chatbot informed by knowledge outputs generated from specific communities, mining their data. How to produce: the team will develop a chatbot that can analyze and integrate local data from various sources. The junior programmer will work with the interface while the assistant will compile the knowledge base. And then duplication detection AI as the last one. Explains what it is. The team will develop the algorithm capable of identifying similar questions by analyzing research content and metadata. And then it gives roles for the architect, the junior programmer, and the assistant. So it looks like the assistant will be somebody who's helping to collate the data, help organize it. Perhaps the architect has got the overall vision in mind. And the junior programmer is someone who's going to concentrate on the interface, which is quite consistent with what we had in mind, but it's giving us a start about how to structure it, how to frame it. Daniel says it looks to all it needed was that you needed to write continue, and if I write continue now, it might continue and just add to this and reconclude its conclusion. So
well, I mean, and isn't that such an example where we can actually say it's as good as the input and the prompts that we offer it? And so, Daniel, I don't know about you, but Krish and I both subscribe to the $20 a month version of ChatGPT.
Yeah, I do too.
It's always available, all of that kind of thing. So in a sense, many of us have started to use ChatGPT, and Stephen's point about dystopian and utopian outputs is really, really pretty profound. I, in the last 4 months, have sped up my sense of productivity by using ChatGPT for all sorts of things. One thing I'm very clear that I'm not using it for is to write my papers. But I'm getting it to write all sorts of other busy work that has taken me an hour or two, and it's now taking me 5 or 6 minutes. And so that's really important. But our input is really important. Stephen, I want to just ask you to answer that last question before we leave, not because I want to perpetuate this kind of doomsday scenario, but what is the basis on which Eliezer is saying that this could be the end of us? Is it an economic crisis? Is it a war over knowledge?
Yeah, he doesn't specify, but let me give you one of probably millions of possible scenarios in which the world could end. This is really a low point to end our. I'll give you one. ChatGPT, but more importantly, some of the other ones that are coming up, which is Copilot and Replit and a whole bunch of others, are reaching human level performance at writing code. Okay. And by the end of this year, ChatGPT would be as good as an expert software developer rather than just a reasonably good developer. Not only can it write code, but it can also understand code. Even now, you can give it a code and you can say, please tell me in English what this code does, and it will tell you in English what this code does. And thirdly, an example a couple of weeks ago of somebody who used ChatGPT 4 and gave it a piece of code and said, please find the security vulnerabilities in this code. You take those 3 pieces of information together, move them forward a couple of months, and somebody is going to say, please punch into the servers at the Hoover Dam in the United States and open the sluice gates. Please make a biological agent that will kill everybody on the western side of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one of the very real and very close scenarios that could end up in a humanity-destroying event. But there are many others, which financial collapse could be another one. He's talking about superintelligence when the computers decide they really don't need us anymore because we're using a hell of a lot of resources, so they'll just take away our food and we're more of a bother than it's worth. He's talking about those what seem to be science fiction scenarios now, but there are ones that are much closer, like the code example I just gave you.
Okay, great, thank you. Colleagues, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I'd like to ask you to just join me in thanking our panelists, Professor Stephen Sidley, Advaitha Naidu, Dr. Hangi Chen, and Krish Chetty. Perhaps you can give them a hand either in real life or by showing an emoticon. I'd also like to ask you just to briefly put your cameras on, because we want to take a couple of screenshots just for when we write something about our seminar. And thank you all so much for making this a dialogue. Liz, thank you for your contribution. Joanne, Peter, Daniel, colleagues who've participated in the chat. What it really has also done is it's helped us to see who's really interested in this area, both in South Africa, on the continent, in the global south, and across our BRICS countries. So thank you to the participants from Russia and India and Brazil, and further afield. We really, really appreciate your input. And we have asked, we're going to ask ChatGPT to summarize the contents of this dialogue because, you know, busy work is over. And we'll circulate that for you. The recording will also be available. And we look forward to having some more conversations in the future. And for you to get hold of us should you want to be involved in some of the work that we're doing, because we're committed to data socialism. We want the data to be out there. We want people across the digital divide to be able to access some of this information. So thank you all so very, very much. Thank you again, Krish and Advaitha, Stephen, and Hong Yi. Really appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Krish, have you got some photos?
Thanks to everyone. It was really, really great.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much.
I'm taking a few screenshots as we go. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please put your camera on if you can. Yeah.
Sorry, Charlene. I don't even know how I came across this invite. It somehow popped into my email and then I made it happen. Is there any way that I can get onto some sort of email list for future, talks along these lines?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can just follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, right? Those are the two ways to follow the HSRC. But Daniel, I mean, please just drop myself or Krisha an email. You can just Google us, right? And we'll come up as an hsrc.ac.za address. It's just our names, S. Swartz or K. Chetty. But yeah, I mean, it'll be good to talk to you because we really want to go Hong Yi's way of partnership, business, government, civil society. Those are the ways in which we really like to operate. So thank you. And Stephen, we look forward to more Daily Maverick articles from you. So that'll be brilliant. Yeah. Wow.
Thanks.
What an exciting discussion. Thank you.
And well chaired.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, that's well done.
Thank you. Joanne, I was about to be rude to policymakers, but thank you for your contribution. You've restored my confidence in the policymakers of our country.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Stephen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'm just going to copy this chat.
Yes, thank you. And I think let's put the recording off, Krish.